and for your support for the summer school. And I just, having done it, as you heard on the first lecture, 45 times, it's sad to see, what the pandemic has done to an institution like this. But the summer school, the UCT summer school, is a unique institution, and it really deserves somehow every bit of support that we can give it. And Mehdi and Zulaiga and her staff do a wonderful job in keeping going against all the odds. And I just think we must try to do what we can to support it. It's worth it. Well, if that's the case, don't tell me. But it may well be the case. All right. Today we're going to look at the end of the Napoleonic story, and to see how this great adventure sort of comes to an end. And it's the kind of end of a story that would have killed off almost every sort of romance in the world. But in this case, it doesn't. And that's just another of the extraordinary things about Napoleon. It ends with a whimper, not a bang. And yet, the legend survives. So today we're going to look at how that happened. Yesterday we talked about Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. And when he had reached comparative safety, that was actually, in the old kingdom of Poland, he held a war conference with what was left of his staff. And the most urgent news was that a coup d'etat had been attempted in Paris, and it had come shockingly close to success. And Napoleon felt his presence was needed more in Paris than with the remnants of his army, and his generals agreed with him. And what had happened was that this man, Colonel Mallet, had simply announced that Napoleon had been killed in Russia and that he had handed over executive power to him. And for about 4 days, he managed to get away with it. And so Napoleon commandeered the fastest transport available, and he made the return journey from Warsaw to Paris in an astonishing 13 days. So how is he to explain to the world this devastating, humiliating reverse? His instinct was to issue a bulletin to the anxious public. What does he say? His Majesty's health has never been better. Well, it's an absolutely typical Napoleonic response, the confusion between his own interests and that of the nation. On several occasions, he said, "I am France and France is me." And one of Napoleon's great strengths was that he was one of those lucky people who believed their own propaganda. Hot on the heels of the retreating army, the enemy wolves closed in for the kill. The Russian army cleared Russian soil of the last invaders and then pressurized the Prussians into signing an alliance against Napoleon. And this became what was known as the nucleus of what became known as the Sixth Coalition. And Britain had never ceased to be at war with France, so her participation was a given. And the nations in red now form the Sixth Coalition. To that, they add several smaller German states, and Spain and Portugal, although Spain was still theoretically under French control, but not in practice, and Sweden, where a strange thing had happened, which you may know of, and that was that the Swedes had asked Napoleon to suggest an heir for their king who was about to die childless. And so Napoleon suggested one of his marshals, Marshal Bernadotte, not because he had any great love for Bernadotte. In fact, he and Bernadotte had a very bad relationship, but Bernadotte was married to Napoleon's first fiancée, Désirée. Do you all know this story? And anyway, it was really to do Désirée a favor that he suggested Bernadotte as a king for Sweden. Once on the throne of Sweden, Bernadotte lost no time in betraying his former master and ally and immediately joined the Allies against France. And curiously, of course, the House of Bernadotte is still very much on the throne of Sweden today. All the other Napoleonic thrones have disappeared, but the Bernadottes are still very much in charge in Sweden today. Right, so they add these smaller states, and the big question is, what would the attitude of Austria be? Well, the Austrians had been defeated so many times that they were wary of exposing themselves to future damage. And of course, there was another problem in the Austrian situation, and that was that Napoleon was now married to Marie-Louise, who was the daughter of the Austrian emperor. And so this marriage alliance complicates their foreign policy. So the Allied armies advance into central Germany, and by heroic efforts, Napoleon manages to raise another army of 180,000. And with these mostly raw young troops, he won two quite brilliant victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, which are near the city of Leipzig. But on both occasions, he was unable to follow up his battlefield success. Casualties on both sides had been so heavy that they agreed to an armistice, while both sides jockey for Austrian support. And the Austrians actually offered Napoleon support if he would return the Dalmatian coast and Tyrol. Now, I'm supposed to have a marker, don't worry, but the Dalmatian coast is what we now call, it's that bit on the west side of the Adriatic Sea. Can you all see what I'm talking about? And Tyrol is the little bit sort of on the Austrian Alps. They say, give us back those and we will support you. So what do you think Napoleon says? Not a chance. He said, I don't need to make concessions in order to have your support. I've managed without it for 15 years. I don't need it now. The result was that the Austrians now join the already huge coalition forces. And in October of 1813, 365,000 Allied troops joined battle with 195,000 French at Leipzig. Even Napoleon's genius couldn't overcome such odds. Well, the non-French element is being reduced now because people are beginning to desert Napoleon, as it were. So 90% of this army is French. But most of them, are either very young boys or very old men, because the rest have been used up, so to speak. And the result of this battle, as I said, it was the biggest battle fought on European soil before the First World War, possibly the biggest battle ever fought before the First World War. And the result was a comprehensive defeat. Napoleon has no option but to return to France. So that's October. In November, the Austrian Chancellor, Metternich, whom you may have heard of, a very sort of vital European statesman of this period, offered Napoleon new peace terms. And these were called the Frankfurt Proposals. Napoleon could retain the title of emperor, he could retain the title, he could retain the rulership of France, and France would be allowed to retain its so-called natural frontiers, the Alps, the Rhine, and the Pyrenees. And broadly speaking, that was how France would have looked if Napoleon had accepted the Frankfurt Proposals. Do you see, in other words, it would include lots of what we think of today as Belgium, as Western Germany, and Northern Italy. In other words, France could retain all the conquests they'd made before 1801, Belgium, Savoy, and the Rhinelands. It was an astonishingly generous offer. And Metternich was motivated. Why does Metternich make him such a generous offer? It's because he's motivated by two anxieties. One was his fear that Russia is becoming too strong, and the other was that the fall of Napoleon might usher in another extremist revolutionary government in France. Okay, better Napoleon than chaos. The British even agreed to it because their ambassador had misunderstood the details. But they were saved by Napoleon. Once again, he said, I don't need to make concessions. I mean, here's somebody, he's really a rat in a trap, and yet he's still not prepared to make concessions. The Allies crossed into French soil, facing their strength of 325,000. Napoleon could now muster about 70,000. Too late now, he applies for peace terms on the basis of the Frankfurt proposals. The Allies say, sorry, this no longer applies. They insisted on returning France to its 1791 boundaries, meaning that they would have to give up Belgium, the northern provinces here, and give up the Rhineland. Napoleon refuses to consider it. For a few months, his little army fights a brilliant rearguard action against overwhelming odds. The Allies began to quarrel and to fall apart. And the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, goes to France in order to meet his allies, and he binds them into what becomes known as the Quadruple Alliance, whereby they agree, firstly, to continue fighting until Napoleon's been defeated, secondly, not to make any separate peace treaties, thirdly, to remain in alliance for 4 years after they defeated Napoleon. And they also agree that the effort to pin down Napoleon's little army was futile. Instead, they would go straight for Paris and force the surrender of the capital. And that was, of course, the right strategy. So, here is a famous painting of the Russian army entering Paris, Alexander at its head, marching down the Champs-Élysées. Now, Paris had no stomach for a fight. They didn't want to share the fate of Moscow. And Napoleon's marshals inform Napoleon that they think it would be unwise to fight on. Napoleon has actually no option but to abdicate. Now, this film clip sort of shows this situation. This is where he's at Fontainebleau, and he's being told by the marshals, give up, it's all over. He's accepted their advice. Okay. Excellent. When I first saw that film, came out in 1970. I don't know whether you may have seen it. It is available on YouTube, the whole thing, free. So if you're interested, have a look at it. And when I first saw that film, I thought Rod Steiger was really hamming up the part. I took quite a dislike to him for several years after that. And then I read the text of what Napoleon had actually said at the time. And this is from the book by Cronin, which I think I've recommended to you, which I actually think is possibly the best of the one-volume biographies of Napoleon. And he wrote, "It was a cold day. The guardsmen were lined up in 2 ranks before the brick palace. They wore dark blue uniforms faced with scarlet, white straps, black bearskins with red pom-poms. Napoleon faced the meticulously straight ranks. His emotion passed into his words and a catch in his voice. 'Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you goodbye. You have been models of courage and loyalty. With men like you, our cause was not lost. France's happiness was my one thought, and it will always be what I wish for most. Don't be sorry for me. I want to write about the great things we have done together. Goodbye, my sons. Goodbye, my children. I would like to press you all to my heart. At least I shall kiss your flag.' And as the ensign marched forward, bearing the eagle and flag, those grizzled warriors, says Caulaincourt, who was his chief aide-de-camp, could not restrain their tears. They cried openly. Napoleon grasped the square of silk embroidered in gold, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Eylau, Friedland, Wagram, Berlin, Madrid. He embraced it for half a minute, then he lifted his hand and said, 'Adieu, keep me in your memory.' And he turned round, entered his carriage, and was carried off at a gallop." So, when I read that, I realized that it wasn't Rod Steiger who was hamming it up, it's Napoleon. You know, Napoleon is always acting. He's always manipulating his audience. He's always exploiting his supporters. And what we can't explain is why some people are able to get away with that kind of thing and others aren't. But Napoleon was somebody who could. Anyway, he was removed from office and he was sent to the island of Elba. And on the map now, you see where the island of Elba is. It's off the west coast of Italy. And he would be allowed to take 400 men with him. He could retain the title of emperor. He would be paid an annual pension of 2 million francs. But the Napoleonic adventure was over. Well, Napoleon boarded a carriage and he took the long, bitter road to Fréjus on the Mediterranean coast. And the journey took them through some of the most royalist parts of France. Jeering crowds lined the route, some of them pelting his carriage with stones and rotten fruit. And Napoleon ignominiously exchanged places with a footman and rode ahead of the carriage with the outriders. The whole ordeal was so depressing that he tried to commit suicide by swallowing a phial of opium. The potion didn't work, and instead he was just embarrassingly sick. And at Fréjus, an English ship was waiting to take him to Elba. And the ship's captain, Captain Usher, so hated Napoleon that he refused even to record his name on the ship's log. He'd say, "the distinguished personage now on board." 5 days later, by the time they reached Elba, Napoleon had agreed to become godfather to Usher's 2 children. Absolutely typical. Napoleon was offloaded on the island, while on the mainland, the Allies made preparation for a great international conference in Vienna. And Napoleon had been so obviously rejected by the French people, there was no need for any undue hurry, or, for that matter, any excessive anxiety about safeguarding the prisoner. And the job of official custodian was handed to a Scot, Colonel Neil Campbell, and there he is looking sort of impressive and custodial, but he was conducting a torrid affair with a woman in Florence, and he took frequent absences to advance his cause. Napoleon gave the impression of being demoralized by his fate, a mere spectator to events. It was just one more piece of evidence that the Napoleonic adventure was well and truly over. However, on Elba, things were not quite what they seemed. Napoleon's friends were keeping him fully abreast of events in Europe. And what they told him was that in France, the Bourbon restoration was proving to be deeply unpopular. It looked too much as if the Bourbons were just the starting point for restoring the privileges and the possessions of the aristocracy and the clergy. People made unflattering contrasts between the unprepossessing Louis XVIII and the glamour and the panache of the empire. And the message his friends were giving him was that if it could be done, an attempt to overthrow the Bourbons might well be successful. Now, the only two of his family who had accompanied him to Elba were his sister Pauline and his mother. And here is Pauline, known often as the Venus of Empire. And she obviously was a fine-looking woman and absolutely sort of ditzy bimbo, but very lovable. And she pawned almost all the jewelry that she had been given by her very wealthy Italian husband, Prince Baiocchi, to provide him with the funds to launch this expedition. And his mother, who'd previously always erred on the side of caution and restraint, now said to him, "You were not born to die on this island." And so, with this blessing, he decided to make one last risk and see what came of it. He'd been allowed to take a navy of one ship to the island, and to that they added the hire of two more, enough to transport about 1,600 people to France. Napoleon had no illusions that 1,000 men would reconquer France. He said many times he would return to Paris without shedding a drop of French blood. The eagle, he said, will fly from steeple to steeple until it alights on the spire of Notre Dame. And the return journey involved going through or close to the areas which had so vehemently rejected him only 10 months earlier. And somebody was asking me earlier, why did the French put up with the Napoleonic reverses for so long? Well, obviously a lot of them didn't, and a lot of them were hostile to Napoleon, and the south of France was one case in particular. And so this is the route that Napoleon takes. This is the route Napoleon, as it's now known, and this is going from Cannes on the coast to Grenoble. And at Grenoble, he more or less is welcomed by the local population and by the local garrison. And after that, it isn't a sort of race anymore. He comes back in a sort of carriage lined by thousands of cheering people. But it's a very good trip, this, incidentally, if ever you want a sort of nice week's holiday. It took Napoleon a week to do it. And it'll take you about a week because you have to look for all the places where it says Napoleon had a meal here, or somebody came to wash his feet here, or the peasants came to applaud him here, or whatever. There's even a place saying Napoleon had a pea here. And incidentally, all these places that I've described are really good sort of touring value. Elba, for instance, is another lovely island, to visit for any number of reasons, but particularly for its Napoleonic associations. And Fontainebleau, where you saw him say adieu to his old guard. We actually went to the 200th anniversary of that event, where they repeated what we saw on the film absolutely soldier for soldier, word for word, beautifully done. And his attempt to return to France starts badly, with the garrison at Cannes rejecting him. And it made Napoleon decide that he would have to avoid Marseille and the Rhone Valley by going over the mountains, and that's what they do. We need to travel faster than the news, was his policy. And his journey over the so-called Route Napoleon has now rightly become one of the most epic chapters of the Napoleonic legend. And I'm one of those who think that it's possibly the most remarkable episode in his career, because as we said yesterday, the Napoleon of 1815 was a far cry from the emperor, of the Napoleon rather, of 1796. In 1815, he's 45 years old, sorry, balding, paunchy, defeated many times in battle, responsible for unpopular economic and authoritarian policies. After his first abdication, his foreign minister Talleyrand, we talked about this yesterday, had extracted fabulous terms from the Allies on the grounds that it should be Napoleon they were punishing, not the good French people who'd been intimidated and cowed by Napoleon. Talleyrand even managed to allow the Allies to keep the art treasures looted from conquered countries on the grounds that having to return them might inflame Parisian opinion and trigger revolutionary riots. But when Napoleon meets the French army at this place, the Pré de la Rencontre, in other words, the field of the meeting, which is a sort of barren plain about 10 miles south of Grenoble. And basically, he is just at the head of a group of by then about 7,500 men. They're virtually unarmed. And he says to them, he says to the French army who come to meet him, if any one of you wants to shoot your emperor, here I am. And instead of shooting him, of course, they shout, Vive l'Empereur, and they rally round him, and that's the end of the sort of attempt to try to block him. When we went to see this place, the Pré de la Rencontre, there was actually a hotel on the site called the Bivouac Napoleon, which was for sale for 180,000 francs. And I seriously thought about a change of career and thought this might be a wonderful place to set up a kind of Napoleonic sort of study center. However, that's not quite how I work, so I didn't. But it's still there. I'm not sure what it does today. But here on the Pré de la Rencontre, I mean, no one could now claim that Napoleon had intimidated and cowed the French people into supporting him. In fact, he'd been naked and defenseless, and the people effectively had armed him. Okay. News of Napoleon's escape caused consternation in Vienna, where the delegates at the Congress were meeting. And they break off their discussions and they hurry home to make preparations to resume battle. Before they disperse, they pronounce Napoleon an outlaw. And it gave license to anyone prepared to kill him. And in Paris, people are undergoing an agonizing test of loyalties. Famously, the French press reacted to his return. After day one, they say, the monster has escaped from Elba. Day two, the ogre has landed in Cannes. Day three, the fiend has reached Grenoble. Day four, the tyrant has reached Lyon. Day five, the usurper is within 150 miles of the capital. Day six, Bonaparte moves forward with rapid strides. Day seven, tomorrow Napoleon will be at our gates. Day eight, His Majesty is at Fontainebleau. Day 9, the Emperor is enthroned in Paris. And that was the famous sequence with which the French press greeted his return. And back in the palace of the Tuileries, Napoleon tries to buy support with a much more democratic system of government. We don't have time for those details now. But essentially, he has to deal with foreign problems. He knows that the Russians and the Austrians are mobilizing their armies, but they wouldn't be ready for war for at least 3 months. What he has to do instead is to eliminate the two armies that were battle ready, which were Napoleon's International Army of Observation in Brussels and Blücher's Prussian army, which was quartered on the Rhine. Now, if he could prevent those two from coalescing and combining, then in spite of his numerical disadvantage, he might be able to create a strong enough position to deal with the whole Allied threat. And as you know, in this ambition, he was almost successful. Now, Waterloo, we'll spend 10 minutes talking about Waterloo. It's been sometimes described as the heavyweight championship of history. Two outstanding commanders, both 45 years old, both born, in fact, within a few months of each other, theoretically at the top of their game, with forces of roughly equal size, and the ring in which they fought was actually one of the smallest of all famous battlefields, the whole of which can be seen from a single viewpoint. And when you go to Waterloo today, you see this huge artificial mound called the Butte de Lyon, which the Dutch put up to commemorate the glorious part played in the battle by the Prince of Orange, which wasn't glorious at all, but that's another matter. But from the top of that mound, you get a wonderful view of the whole battlefield. You can see across the entire field. And it's another wonderful place to go to Waterloo, because there's been a preservation order on the battlefield. You're not allowed to alter anything. You're not even allowed to plant different crops. So you can see exactly what it looked like. And we've been there several times, in fact, on June the 18th once, which is the date of the battle, almost Midsummer's Day. And the houses on the battlefield, there are 3 farms on the battlefield, and you're not even allowed to patch up the bullet marks. And so it's a very authentic situation. And on the battlefield, there's always been a wonderful museum, but they built a new one in 2015, to commemorate the bicentenary. And it's an absolutely wonderful sort of multimedia museum. But why I'm mentioning it at all is because at the shop at the museum, they sell 9 souvenirs of Napoleon to every one of Wellington. And that's absolutely, normally, the winners get all the credits, not the losers. And the time of the battle was actually only a single day. In fact, not even that, about 8 hours of fighting. Lots of people have said that it decided the fate of the world, and I don't think it did, because had Napoleon won the battle, I suspect that the Allies would simply have regrouped and sort of found another time and place at which to tackle him. He'd left too many proofs that left at large, he was too much of a danger to world peace. Now, what Napoleon's hoping to do, very briefly, is to occupy the city of Brussels, which was at that time the headquarters of Wellington's army. And in their knapsacks, as they marched to Waterloo, his officers were carrying the dress kit they expected to wear for the celebratory ball that evening. And it sounds very arrogant, but it was basically the only option open to them. And what Wellington knows is that whatever happens, because that's how Napoleon has been all his life, Napoleon will go onto the attack. And so Wellington knows that he has to find a battlefield of his own choosing, somewhere on the road from Paris to Brussels, and he finds one with a noticeable north to south slope, meaning that the French would have to march uphill, and most crucially, behind which there was a ridge on the northern side, behind which he could protect and conceal his armies. And along that ridge, even better, ran a road from east to west, which enabled Napoleon to cover large areas of ground while directing his troops. Now, when you think of that, it's obvious that Napoleon should have had a plan B in reserve. But one thing we know about Napoleon is that he doesn't have plan Bs. You know, plan A always works, and if it doesn't work, well, that's it. And it starts well, Waterloo starts well for the French, with the French taking on the British army and the Prussian army separately, and actually getting the better of both of them, but not managing to cripple either of them. So, what Napoleon hopes now is that he can keep them apart. And so he detaches one army corps, 30,000 men under Marshal Grouchy, and he tells him to make sure that the Prussians and the British do not manage to combine. Now, for all sorts of reasons, good and bad, Grouchy doesn't fulfill that mission, and thereby he allows Wellington and Blücher to team up later in the battle, and it also deprives Napoleon of a crucial 30,000 troops. So Napoleon arrives on the 17th of June at the southern end of what was to be the battlefield of Waterloo, and he makes his headquarters in a small farmhouse, which today is a little museum, which you can see for yourselves. And in it, he sets up his campaign headquarters and his campaign bed. And Wellington, meanwhile, is installed just north of the battlefield at what was the town hall of the little village of Waterloo, which is also now a museum. And interestingly, it rained all night on the night of the 17th of June. First of all, that meant that they don't get a wink of sleep, the soldiers, but of course soldiers often didn't. But secondly, it also drenched the fields and paths, making treacherously slippery conditions for Napoleon's attack. And that was why he waits until 11 o'clock in the morning before he gives the signal for advance, although he knows that every minute that passes is a crucial minute to allow the Prussians to join the battlefield. And on the battlefield, there are 3 farmhouses. I'm not going to go into great detail, but on the battlefield, there are 3 farmhouses. Those farmhouses, incidentally, were vital to the fate of the battle, because unless you could control the farmhouses, you ran the risk of an enemy stronghold in your midst. So these 3 farmhouses proved the kind of nucleus of the battle for all day. On one of the farmhouses, the one on the eastern side, the French took it early in the day, but lost it later in the day to the Prussians. The second one, in the center of the battlefield, the French took in mid-afternoon, and they kept control of it. And the third one, this is Hougoumont, the British held out against the French for the whole day. And Wellington later said that it was the hinge on which the whole battle had swung. And this battlefield, this farmhouse, has now been taken over by the Landmark Trust, and you can actually stay there for a couple of nights or whatever, should you so wish to, in a lovely atmospheric sort of place and a beautiful reconstruction they've made of it. And the French have the advantage of the artillery and cavalry, but the artillery isn't very effective because Wellington can always tuck his troops in the ridge behind the battlefield. The cavalry were more of a threat, but the British had a standard tactic for dealing with cavalry, and that was to form hollow squares. Do you all understand what I mean by that? And so the horses have to charge, as it were, a square, the front of which every man is armed with a bayonet. And horses very, very rarely are prepared to risk charging into such an obvious danger. And so basically, it's a sort of stalemate. But by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Prussians are pouring into the eastern edge of the battlefield. And things are pretty close to being over. And Napoleon has to turn to one last throw of the dice, his famous Imperial Guard. Now, the Imperial Guard, well, incidentally, this is the French charge, and here are the hollow squares. That's quite a nice sort of illustration of how it would have worked. And at times, you know, the horsemen and the soldiers are within about 6 or 8 feet of each other, looking into each other's eyes. And the horsemen can't charge because of the bayonets, and the soldiers can't load their guns to fire, because as soon as they put the guns down, you know, the horsemen charge. And so it's an extraordinary sort of stalemate. So Napoleon now throws in the Imperial Guard, which is one of those elite regiments which are too precious to use in battle, and to hope that they might dislodge the British formations. But they failed, and eventually they had to fall back in retreat. And that was the moment at which the battle was won. All round the battlefield, the cry went up, "The Guard retreats." And the British cavalry, almost unused to that point, now harry the Guard and pick them off as they flee from the battlefield. And the only reason there was not more carnage was because darkness had now begun to fall. And in the dark, Napoleon and his staff flee from the battlefield in the golden carriage in whose lining Napoleon had always had 2 million gold francs concealed. So Napoleon returns to Paris, the city which had given him such a rapturous welcome 3 months earlier. There were still people who urged him to fight on, and there were uncoordinated army units in action all over the place. And his brother Lucien said to him, "Be bold." And Napoleon replied, "I've been too bold." If he'd acted immediately, something might have been achieved, but he seemed paralyzed into inactivity. One moment demanding an army review, the next moment ready to abdicate in favor of his son. You remember we talked about him? "It's not a question of myself," he told an aide, "it's a question of France." Once again, trying to persuade himself that his interests were identical with the nation. But eventually, the French Parliament pronounces an edict of abdication, and Napoleon accepts that rather than take responsibility for a civil war. His next hope was to be allowed to escape to the United States. And the United States had said that if he could manage it, they would be willing to accept him. He goes to the West Coast and he boards a frigate, but the British fleet is waiting for him. He spends a last night on French soil at the Ile d'Aix, and that's worth a visit too, incidentally. And he's already a prisoner, effectively. And in the morning, he goes out and surrenders to a British admiral, throwing himself on the mercy of what he calls the bravest and most generous of my enemies. And actually, it was a sensible attitude to take, because the Prussians and the Russians were making no secret of their preference to execute him as an outlaw and a criminal. So the British were by far the best bet. And Napoleon always claimed that he had believed that he'd be allowed to settle in England. He always claimed, in fact, that he wanted to become a farmer in Devon. You know, can you imagine it? But that's just another typical Napoleonic distortion and manipulation of the truth. But it did mean that the decision of what to do with Napoleon was left in the hands of the British. Not only in the hands of the British, but they accept the burden of paying for his captivity too. So after a month of decision, they decide to send him to St. Helena, 4,500 miles away in the South Atlantic. And their decision was swayed by a recommendation from the Duke of Wellington, who had stopped off there on his way back from India in 1806. Napoleon protested bitterly. "How can you send me, to this godforsaken island in the middle of the ocean?" But he only had himself to blame. No one was going to risk placing him close enough to Europe to stage another escape from Elba. He arrives on St. Helena in October 1815. He's only 46 years old. He could have had expectations of another 30 years of life on the island. However, he dies only 5.5 years later at the age of 51. But in terms of his own meteoric career, 5 years must have seemed like eternity. And that point is very well illustrated by a story that in their long evenings on St. Helena, the French entourage would sometimes hold play readings, usually from Molière or Racine. And when they finished, Napoleon would snap shut his copy of the script and say, "Well, gentlemen, another victory over time." I'm not going to go into detail about his time on St. Helena because that's the subject of a special lecture that I'm giving tomorrow morning. But for any normal human being, this humiliating captivity would have dealt a death blow to the reputation and the hopes of immortality. Instead, Napoleon manages to convert it into a platform for the most extraordinary rehabilitation of any fallen hero. His time on St. Helena has often been described as his last and most successful campaign. And in the mists of St. Helena, the megalomaniac control freak who was responsible for the deaths of 2 million Europeans suddenly becomes the romantic champion of egalitarianism, liberalism, and the cult of the individual. And more than any other figure I can think of, Napoleon sort of blurs the dividing lines between the head and the heart. And eventually it gave rise to something called Bonapartism. And Bonapartism was a sort of benign authoritarian nationalism. And it was pretty similar to the policies of some of the worst demagogues in modern politics. And I'm leaving you to fill in the names. Except that in Napoleon's time, it wasn't competing with democracy, but with mostly the hereditary rule of kings and princes. And Bonapartism was the platform which enabled his nephew Louis to be elected to the presidency in 1848, which he converted 4 years later into the Second Empire. Here's a depiction of Napoleon on board the Bellerophon being taken actually to the British south coast. It was the Northumberland that took him to St. Helena. And here is an image of Napoleon gardening on St. Helena. He became a very keen gardener, not that he was in the least interested in gardens, but because there was a clause in his sort of conditions which said that the sentries were not allowed within 80 meters of the gardens. So Napoleon cunningly expanded the gardens as far as he could in order to keep the sentries as far away from him as possible. So, is there another one? And here is his nephew, the Emperor Napoleon III, looking very imposing. Napoleon III was actually even shorter than Napoleon I. He was only about 5'4". Napoleon was 5'6". And he had a very strange sort of condition whereby he couldn't grow hair on his cheeks. So he developed a new style of beard called the beard imperial, which suddenly became the absolute fashion statement, of the mid-19th century. Well, that's a bit of a triumph if you could convert a disability into a fashion statement. Anyway, Napoleon III, it's another wonderful story. And he actually becomes Emperor of France and rules France for 22 years, much longer than his uncle. And the Second Empire was the ultimate acknowledgement of the rehabilitation of Napoleon and the Emperor and the Empire. It's a statement of French identification with Napoleon's ambitions and his methods. And it's something that the French have never disowned. And when President Macron spoke at the commemoration of Napoleon's bicentenary in May 2021, he had a very delicate balancing act to perform, because there's so much controversy today over Napoleon's attitudes to women and slavery. And here you see Macron and Brigitte at the bicentenary celebration at Napoleon's tomb, which I'm sure many of you have seen. And if you haven't, that's another fantastic, wonderful piece of sort of architectural theatre. And what Macron said was, and he couldn't sort of go too all out into a sort of full-scale approval, and he couldn't sort of condemn him. He said, we love Napoleon because his life gives us a taste of what is possible if we accept the invitation to take risks. Well, that's a pretty sort of nicely judged, neutral statement. And I often think, sort of on the same topic, about 15 years ago, I was asked by Oxford University to speak at Campsfield House, which is an immigration detention centre just outside Oxford for asylum seekers. In other words, for people who have come to England in the hope of being granted British citizenship. And I was asked to speak to them on the subject of Napoleon. Well, you know, I couldn't imagine that this was something they really wanted to hear, but I did my bit. And I mean, here in front of you is this sort of United Nations audience of refugees from all over the world. And they hadn't seemed particularly interested in what I said. But when I finished, a pack of them crowded around me, asking me to repeat the last few words of my lecture. And I had to check my script to see what it was that I'd said, which they all then wrote down. And it said, what I'd said was, Napoleon is the living proof that with enough ability, luck, and self-belief, anything is possible for any human being. And that was what they wanted to hear, of course. And I think actually there's no better place on which to finish a course on Napoleon. Thank you. Okay, I'm very happy to take questions. Yes.
What did Napoleon die of?
Almost certainly cancer of the stomach. Sorry, I must, for the benefit of the people online, I'm asked what Napoleon died of, and almost certainly it was cancer of the stomach. His father had died of cancer of the stomach. Two of his sisters died of cancer of the stomach. There are all sorts of stories that he was poisoned, or that even that the wallpaper on St. Helena sort of leached enough arsenic to kill him. But I think those are not likely to have happened. Yes? Well, I don't think so, really. A psychopath is somebody who has no kind of, sorry, I'm asked, was Napoleon a psychopath? And a psychopath is somebody who has no kind of ability to empathize with other people's feelings. And that's not quite true, because Napoleon did actually have very dear, intimate feelings for other people. Of course, on his own terms, you might say, but I wouldn't have called him a psychopath. How many widows were there, I'm asked? How many widows, indeed, I'm asked, were there in France? And the answer is, you know, there were probably 500,000. I mean, a lot. But many of them felt they'd given up their husbands or sons or fathers in a good cause. You know, difficult to quantify. Yes. I see. You're also applying for refugee status. I said Napoleon was the living proof that with enough ability, luck, and self-belief, anything is possible for any human being. Right. Any other questions?
Yes. Online, my name's Linda. Is it possible that we can link into your lecture tomorrow?
Yes, I think so, as far as I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that a summer school? Is that a summer school event?
Yes, you have to buy a ticket for it, though.
Okay, thank you.
Buy a ticket for it. Apparently, it's available online. Yeah. Actually, it was quite interesting. A question I've asked was, do I see Donald Trump using Napoleon as a role model? Well, interesting, Donald Trump did make a few references to Napoleon, but he actually got the wrong Napoleon. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, the point is Donald Trump is using quite similar tactics to Napoleon. And, you know, let's give him credit where it's due. I mean, he gets away with things that you wouldn't imagine a normal human being could, but not with quite enough of the people, or not at the moment, at any rate. Any other questions online? No. Any other questions from the floor? Yeah.
Where is Napoleon's tomb?
The one that I showed you, this one. That is in the church called the Invalides, which was the military, sorry, the question I was asked was, where is Napoleon's tomb? And it's in Les Invalides, which was originally a military hospital built by Louis XIV for wounded soldiers. And at the heart of the chapel inside Les Invalides, on the basement, as it were in the basement, they have built this stunning tomb. And the idea is that you circulate it on the sort of floor above it, and you have to bow your head to look at it. It's a fantastic piece of architectural theatre.
Is it in Paris?
Yes, oh yes, sorry, no, right on the banks of the Seine. I mean, Les Invalides has a huge domed sort of ceiling, or roof rather, and it's one of the most prominent landmarks on the Seine. I mean, everyone who goes to Paris should see it. Worth a look. Anything else?
Another question, please. Yes, Linda again. When he was on St. Helena, did Napoleon write a lot about his campaigns and his reign? I mean, did he leave a lot of documents?
Yes, the answer is that he spent every afternoon, more or less, on St. Helena, not actually writing anything, but dictating to his four companions, who become known as the four evangelists, dictating his own version of what had actually happened, you know, in his career. And of course, it's a highly selective, sort of sanitized version of what actually happened. But when the evangelists leave St. Helena, they all publish their accounts of what Napoleon had dictated to them. And all these accounts all become bestsellers, and they're, in a sense, the foundations of the Napoleonic legend.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for giving this really, well, I don't know what to say. As a history student myself, I enjoyed it. So we look forward to tomorrow.
Okay.
I won't say goodbye yet, because tomorrow, are you all going to be there tomorrow? We'll all see you tomorrow in
LT3 tomorrow. Right.
Bring a jersey. No, don't bring a jersey, bring a jacket.
Okay.
And a blanket.